Wow. Going through all this stuff on wars, the stuff you sent, it's really amazing to see this pattern. You get these big, loud reasons for why we're going to war. And then, well, you dig a little deeper and you find stuff that, well, maybe people didn't want to shout about, you know?
Oh, absolutely. War isn't just about armies clashing, is it? It's about the stories we tell ourselves, the stories we tell each other about why those armies are actually fighting. And your sources, they really highlight this gap, this difference between what's said officially, the pretext for war, and the real reasons, the real motivations underneath. And it makes you really think about some of the biggest moments in history in a whole new light.
It does. So that's really what we're going to do today. Dive deep into this disconnect. Why does this happen over and over again? What are the key examples, the ones that really show us how this works? And what does all this mean? Like, what does this tell us about why we fight in the first place? We've got articles, we've got research papers, and knowing you, probably some really sharp observations tucked away in those notes you sent. And honestly, some of the things we found are, well, kind of shocking. I mean, we're talking about political maneuvering that goes back thousands of years, things happening at home that spark wars across the world, and this whole idea of a just war. It gets really complicated.
It does.
So, okay, let's start at the beginning. What are these war pretexts all about? What's their purpose?
Well, you can think of a war pretext as, well, it's kind of like the first step you need to take to start a war. You need a reason, right? Something that makes it seem, well, legitimate. And this reason could be to get people on your side, the public, or to convince your allies, maybe they're not so sure about going to war, or even to deal with all the legal stuff, the rules and laws about war, both within a country and between countries. So these stated reasons, what they call the casus belli, that's just fancy Latin for, the event that starts a war, those reasons, they're all about justification.
So I'd like the story, the carefully crafted story that comes before the actual fighting.
Exactly. And more often than not, as your sources really point out, it's not just, a little bit of spin. These stories, these pretexts, they can be elaborate excuses, very carefully constructed to hide what's really going on. And what's really going on might be a desire for power or to grab resources, economic resources, or even to reshape the geopolitical landscape.
And by geopolitical landscape, we mean?
We mean that complex web of relationships and power dynamics between different countries. Who's got the clout? Who's trying to get more? That kind of thing.
Right. Okay, so this goes way back, doesn't it? Like, think about Julius Caesar, and his campaigns in Gaul, like around 58 BCE. What was the public explanation back then? Something about protecting Rome's allies from those barbarians.
Right. Yeah, that was the official line, the one they put out there. But if you look beyond the Roman propaganda, Caesar's wars in Gaul, well, they start to look a lot more personal. Like they were more about him, his own goals, his own advancement. I mean, those campaigns, they brought him a ton of money. They made him very wealthy. They really solidified the loyalty of his legions, his soldiers, which was super important for any ambitious Roman, if you want to move up the ladder and all of this. It really boosted his political standing back in Rome and all this power and prestige. Well, it gave him what he needed to go up against the Senate and, eventually grab total control. So yeah, that whole defensive story, it was more like a cover for his own ambitions.
So less about keeping Rome safe and more about keeping Caesar in charge. And you know what? This is where it gets really interesting. Let's fast forward a bit to the Franco-Prussian War. That was in 1870. And wasn't the thing that set it all off something about who was going to be the king of Spain?
That's right. The immediate cause, the spark, you could say, was the question of who would inherit the Spanish throne. But the real mastermind behind it all, the guy pulling the strings, was Otto von Bismarck, the minister-president of Prussia. And Bismarck, he was a clever guy. He took a diplomatic telegram, this really famous one, the Ems Dispatch, and he basically twisted it, manipulated it on purpose to provoke France, to get them to declare war. Of course, the Prussians, they said they were just defending themselves against French aggression.
But Bismarck wanted a lot more than just to decide who sat on the Spanish throne, right?
Oh, absolutely. Bismarck's big goal was to unify all those different German states, bring them all together under Prussian leadership. And by starting a war with France, he figured figured he could kind of ignite German nationalism, get them all fired up and pull those southern German states into a tighter alliance with Prussia and the North. So that self-defense story, it actually did two things. One, it made their actions look okay on the world stage. And two, it was really important at home, in Germany, because it brought the German people together against this enemy, this outside threat.
So these pretexts, they're not just about making war look okay to the world. They're also about what's happening inside a country, about politics at home. So how else have we seen this connection between war pretext and domestic politics? How else has it played out in history?
Well, one really clear example is the Gulf of Tonkin incident. This was back in 1964. The Johnson administration, they claimed that North Vietnamese forces had attacked U.S. ships, U.S. Navy ships, in the Gulf of Tonkin. But over the years, a lot of people have questioned, whether that attack even really happened the way they said it did. But regardless, this supposed attack, it became the main reason, the justification for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution.
And that resolution had, like, huge consequences here in the U.S., right? It basically gave President Johnson the power to really ramp things up in Vietnam, to send more troops and get more involved without actually needing Congress to declare war.
Exactly. The resolution gave the president a really wide range of powers to use the military in Southeast Asia. And it did two things. It expanded the power of the president, the executive branch, and it kind of shifted everyone's attention away from some really big problems here at home, problems like the civil rights movement and problems with the economy. So that war pretext, whether it was true or not, it became this powerful tool, a tool for the president to grab more power and to kind of change what the country was focused on.
It's almost like a magician's trick, isn't it? Look over here at this supposed threat, this enemy, while over here the real power moves are happening, the changes in policy right under everyone's noses. What about Pearl Harbor? That was in 1941. There's been a lot of debate over the years about what the U.S. government knew before the attack, but no matter what they knew, how did the attack itself function as a kind of pretext?
That's a great point. Regardless of what intelligence they might have had, the attack on Pearl Harbor, well, it definitely united American public opinion. It put an end to this really strong isolationist feeling that had been around. This idea that America should just stay out of everyone else's business. And President Roosevelt, well, he used that public outrage, the feeling that America had been wrong, to get overwhelming support from Congress to declare war on Japan. On top of that, the attack, well, it basically kicked off the whole wartime economy. Suddenly the country was united, working together, all focused on this one big cause. So in this case, the attack itself and the whole story that was built around it, it became the reason, the absolute justification for a total change in U.S. foreign policy and domestic policy, too.
And it really changed things at home, too, right? It created this unity, this sense of purpose out of what had been a pretty divided country. It really shows how a big event, a shocking event, can be used to change the country's priorities, what everyone is focused on. Let's look at another example, the Spanish-American War. That was in 1898.
Right.
And everyone remembers the slogan, right? Remember the Maine.
Yes, exactly. The explosion of the USS Maine, that ship that blew up in Havana Harbor, it became the main reason, the emotional trigger, you could say, for the United States to declare war on Spain. And the American public, well, they were getting fed all these really sensational stories by the newspapers with, what they called yellow journalism back then. And most people blamed Spain for what happened, even though there wasn't really any solid proof.
But it seems like the real reasons behind the war had more to do with America's, its growing ambitions in the world, right? This desire to become a global power, to expand its influence.
Right. And by imperial ambitions, we mean a nation's desire to expand its territory and influence over other regions.
Right, exactly.
Absolutely. The war, well, it fit perfectly with this rising feeling in the U.S., this idea that America should be expanding, that it should be taking control of more territory. And people like Theodore Roosevelt, they were really pushing for a more aggressive foreign policy. They wanted America to flex its muscles and acquire more colonies, more overseas territories. So the sinking of the Maine, it gave them this seemingly just cause, a reason that everyone could get behind emotionally to intervene in Cuba. And, well, they ended up taking not only Cuba, but the Philippines, too. And this, well, it really expanded American power and influence around the world. So that whole emotional appeal, that cry to remember the Maine, it kind of masked the real political goals and those imperial ambitions that were driving things.
Okay, so up to now, we've talked about cases where it seems like this gap between the pretext and the real motive It was intentional, deliberate. But your sources, they also talk about situations where, well, where it's less about, being tricky and deceptive and more about how complicated international relations really are. Like World War One, Britain said they entered the war to protect Belgium's neutrality. But was that the whole story?
No, not even close. I mean, while the violation of Belgian neutrality, that was definitely a big factor in Britain's decision to declare war on Germany, the real reasons, they went much deeper. You had decades of rivalries between empires, all these different countries competing for power and territory. You had this arms race, everyone building up their weapons, getting ready for war. And there was a growing fear of Germany. Germany was getting more and more powerful very quickly, and that made a lot of people nervous. So yeah, defending Belgium, that was a powerful justification. It sounded good. It had this moral element, protecting a small neutral country. But the real reasons, well, they were all tangled up in this web of geopolitics, all these calculations about power and strategy and alliances. And those deeper reasons, well, they often got simplified or even twisted, through propaganda to
Yeah.
get people ready for war, to mobilize the whole population.
It's a lot easier to get people fired up about a clear moral issue, like protecting a neutral country, than it is to explain, all the ins and outs of empires and power struggles and stuff like that. Now, the Crimean War, that one seems like a really tangled mess of stated reasons and real goals. Russia claimed it was protecting Orthodox Christians in the Ottoman Empire, while Britain said it was all about maintaining the balance of power in Europe. So what was really going on there?
The Crimean War, well, it really shows how complex decisions about war can be. They're never simple. For Russia, sure, protecting Orthodox Christians, that was a good excuse, a way to appeal to people's religious feelings. But the real goal, the strategic goal, was to expand their control over the Black Sea. And that was vital for them, for their navy, for their trade. Now, Britain, they said they were just trying to keep things balanced in Europe, prevent any one country from getting too powerful. But that was tied in with things happening at home in Britain, the Industrial Revolution. It was causing a lot of problems, social unrest, poverty, and the war. Well, it kind of served as a way to bring the country together, focus on a common enemy and to distract people from those domestic problems. So both sides, they had these justifications, these reasons that they knew would resonate with their people, but underneath it all were these much more complicated motives, a mix of geopolitics and domestic politics.
It's like peeling an onion, isn't it? Each layer you peel back, you find another one underneath, and often it's not as pretty as the one before. So this brings us to more recent conflicts. And the Iraq War back in 2003, that's a really powerful example of how these pretexts, they work in the modern world. The main justification, of course, was that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, WMDs.
Yeah, the claim that Iraq had these WMDs, these really scary weapons, and that they were a real immediate threat, that became the main reason, the official justification for the U.S.-led invasion. But as we all know now, those weapons, they were never found. And the real motives, well, they were probably a lot more complicated, a lot more factors involved. Maybe it was about controlling oil or reshaping the Middle East to fit American interests or even dealing with domestic politics in the U.S. after 9/11, things like making the country feel safer or boosting the economy. And of course, they needed to get Congress on board, get their support for military action. And this whole situation, it really shows how in this modern world, with all this technology and information flying around, war pretexts can become very, very sophisticated. They're like weapons of propaganda, tools to create this whole narrative, this story that makes war seem necessary, even if it's not.
It really makes you think, seeing all these examples about what a just war really is. There's this whole concept, just war theory, that talks about having a legitimate cause for war and having moral intent. But how do we square that with all these examples we've seen, where the pretexts are, well, they're often deceptive, misleading?
Yeah, that's the big ethical question, isn't it? Just war theory. It's supposed to give us this framework for thinking about ethics and war, what's right and wrong. It says you need a legitimate cause, you need to have the legal authority to go to war, and your intentions, your goals, they have to be morally justifiable. But the problem is, as we've seen, just looking at the official reasons, the stated just causes, well, that can lead you down the wrong path. Like in the Gulf of Tonkin, that self-defense claim, it was really shaky. A lot of doubt about whether it was even true. And in the Franco-Prussian War, Prussia said it was defending itself, but really Bismarck was just playing this big power game.
Right. So if we can't trust the official reasons, then how can we even figure out if a war is just or not? I mean, where do we even start?
Well, maybe we need to look beyond those official statements, go deeper. We need to analyze the real motives, the hidden ones, and look at how the decision to go to war was actually made. And in the end, we need to consider the long-term consequences, the impact of the war. Like take World War II, the Allied campaign against Nazi Germany. In that case, both the stated goals, things like stopping aggression and protecting freedom, and the underlying motives, well, they seem to line up more closely with the idea of a just war. There was a lot of international support for fighting the Nazis, and they were a real threat, a clear and present danger.
But even then, like you say, your sources point out that there are still ethical problems, moral dilemmas. You can't avoid civilian casualties in a big war. Innocent people are going to die. So even in what seems like a clear-cut, just war, it's never black and white, morally speaking.
Exactly. The whole idea of a just war, it's a really complicated and debated topic, especially when you consider how often those justifications, those reasons for war are, well, they're hidden or manipulated.
Yeah, really makes you think. Which brings us to a really current example, a really important one, the Russia-Ukraine war.
Mm-hmm.
And we've seen Russia give a bunch of different reasons for their actions, both when they took Crimea back in 2014 and then with the full-scale invasion in 2022. So let's break those down.
Okay, so in 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea, they mostly presented it as, as this effort to protect Russian speakers, people who spoke Russian, and they said these people were under threat because of the political changes happening in Ukraine. Then in 2022, when they launched the full-scale invasion, they started giving more reasons, whole list of them. Denazification, demilitarization of Ukraine. And they said they wanted to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO, which Russia claimed was a direct threat to them.
So let me jump in here. This denazification, using that term, connecting Ukraine to Nazism, that seems like a pretty powerful, emotionally charged way to frame things, doesn't it? Especially considering Russia's history, their fight against the Nazis in World War II.
You're absolutely right. It's a deliberate strategy. By invoking this historical trauma, the memory of World War II, they're trying to demonize Ukraine, paint them as the enemy, the new Nazis. It's a way to get people at home in Russia to support the war, even if there's no real basis for it.
Okay, so we've got these stated reasons, but when we dig deeper, like I've done with all these other examples, what seem to be the real motives here, the ones they're not talking about as loudly?
Well, several things seem to be at work. First, there's geopolitics, that big picture stuff about power and strategy. Ukraine, well, it's in a really important spot geographically. It's like a buffer zone between Russia and Europe. And Ukraine they were moving closer to the West, trying to get closer to the European Union and maybe even joining NATO. And Russia saw that as a threat, like someone was moving into their backyard. And then there's the Black Sea, the ports there, and the energy pipelines, the ones that carry oil and gas. Those are really important strategically and economically. And when Russia took Crimea in 2014, well, that was a big part of their plan to control the Black Sea, to be the dominant naval power there.
And this idea of a buffer zone, it's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, you look back through history and you see how often these places that are kind of caught in the middle between two big powers, they become the flashpoints, the places where conflict breaks out. But it's not just about strategy and power on the world stage, is it? It seems like what's happening inside Russia, domestically, that's a big factor too.
Oh, absolutely. Putin's government, they've been using nationalist ideas more and more to keep themselves in power, to get people to support them. And they've also been using it to distract people from the problems at home. The economy's not doing so well, and there's not a lot of political freedom. So the war in Ukraine, well, they're framing it as this battle to defend Russian identity, to stand up to the West. And that kind of narrative, it's really powerful for stirring up nationalist feelings, and it helps Putin stay in control.
It's kind of scary when you think about it, how often these just causes, these reasons for war, well, how often they're not really about what they seem to be about. They're about internal politics, about holding on to power. And this claim about denazification, our sources, they're pretty clear that there's not much evidence to back that up. It seems more like a propaganda tool, a way to manipulate people's emotions.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. I mean, Ukraine's got its own complicated history, like a lot of countries, and they do have some far-right groups, extremists. But there's no real proof that the government or the military is controlled by Nazis or anything like that. So the denazification thing, it looks more like a cynical way to use history, especially the memory of World War II, to justify what Russia's doing. It's like they're trying to make it seem like they're the good guys fighting fascism all over again, but really They have other goals.
So even today, even in this really tragic and current conflict, we see the same pattern that we've seen throughout history. The things they say are the reasons for the war, well, they're hiding a much more complicated reality. A reality of geopolitical ambitions, domestic political calculations, and maybe even economic interests, things like controlling resources.
Sure.
And this just underscores how important it is to always look beyond the surface, to question what we're being told.
I totally agree. The Russia-Ukraine war, it shows us that these modern pretexts, they can be really sophisticated. They blend together these historical grievances, these cultural narratives, these security concerns, all to achieve these complex goals. And when you try to compare the stated goals, the things they say they're fighting for, with the probable real motives, well, it makes it really hard to say if this war, or any war for that matter, is actually a just war. And this really reinforces how important it is to really scrutinize, to examine those underlying causes of conflict. You can't just take those official statements at face value, you have to dig deeper.
So this has been a really insightful and yeah, at times pretty sobering look at this disconnect between why countries say they go to war and the real reasons behind it. And the examples we've talked about, from ancient Rome all the way to what's happening in Ukraine today, they show us this recurring pattern. Political maneuvering, domestic agendas, and these really complex geopolitical factors, and they're all driving these conflicts. And they're also hidden behind these carefully constructed public justifications.
It is a pattern that keeps repeating itself. And the key takeaway for you, the listener, is that you need to be a critical thinker. We've seen how, throughout history, the reasons governments give for going to war, well, they can often hide the real agendas or the real interests. But if you're aware of this pattern, well, you've got a powerful tool. You can see past those surface explanations and start asking deeper questions about what's really driving the conflicts happening in the world today. And remember what you said in your notes about the Peloponnesian War. This pattern, it's not new. It's been going on for a long, long time.
Yeah. So here's something to think about, a final thought for you to chew on. In this world we live in today, with all this information flying around, all this technology, and people trying to manipulate us with information all the time, how can we, as citizens, how can we stay informed? How can we be smart enough, discerning enough to hold our leaders accountable, to make sure they're telling us the truth about why we're going to war? Think about that. Think about how this pattern we've been talking about, how it applies to the conflicts happening right now, and what it means for our hope for a more peaceful world. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.